Happy Lunar New Year, everyone! A few weeks ago, my friend wanted to go to this Vietnamese Buddhist temple, and the lady there, who's super nice, gave us this calendar. And this calendar has a map of the provinces of Vietnam on the front cover. So I can slowly learn all the provinces of Vietnam just by looking at this, from Cao Bang in the north to, let's see, Cà Mau in the south. So I thought, why not actually try to read what's written on one of these calendar dates? And the process, I'll learn some Vietnamese and practice the Chinese vocab inherent in Vietnamese along the way. And as I am an aspiring polyglot and language learner, all of this is still a work in progress. So if you're a speaker of Vietnamese or any of the Chinese languages, please feel free to correct my pronunciation or any inaccuracies if you notice that there are any. So, my first kind of vocabulary item here is Tháng Giêng. So I did look this up. It means the first month of the Lunar New Year. The Tháng part means month in Vietnamese, so that's a good vocab word to remember. In Chinese, we'll probably say, like the Mandarin pronunciation here is 1月, the first month. So that's the kind of characters on the bottom here. Another Chinese way of saying this is actually 正月. That's the Mandarin pronunciation. If you are Vietnamese, the Chinese dialects that you may actually be more exposed to are Cantonese or Teochew. So then I'm also trying to practice those pronunciations for this vocab item here. 蒸魚 in Cantonese. I'm not very good at Teochew, but I did try to look this up. The pronunciation should be something like 家贵. And for me as a Taiwanese American, and like if you're a speaker of any of the Hokkien languages, it will sound something like 家贵. The Mandarin pronunciation is 正月. And then I've written it here in Hanyu Pinyin and as well as the Bopomofo. If you're a Chinese learner, you'll know what those are. This is a tongue-in-cheek joke that I kind of want to mention. So, in English, the word Mandarin, as in Mandarin Chinese, is actually ultimately derived from Sanskrit. So here, I've written Mandarin in Sanskrit within the Devanagari script, and basically, how did this come about, right? As Mandarin Chinese was emerging as a lingua franca between the ministers of China, the Portuguese who went to China applied the word mantri in Malay to describe the language that these ministers would speak. And then mantri in Malay ultimately derives from Sanskrit Mandarin. And in modern-day Indian languages, there will be some version of mantri or mantrin that still means minister. So in Hindi, for example, you can say, सन 2006 में यानी कि 2006 में भारत के प्रधानमंत्री कौन थे? So who was the prime minister of India in the year 2006, right? You can ask a question like that. It means minister. So, one thing I want to point out here is that the first character here in 正月, that is technically pronounced with the level tone in Mandarin as the first tone, as opposed to more common pronunciation with 正, 我正在吃饭, 我正在做功课. It's supposed to be 正月and not 正月. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, second thing I noticed is this phrase, Đứt Wing Dang. So that means essentially the holiday on the first day of a year. So the Đứt is like Vietnamese word for a holiday. In this case, it specifically means the New Year, but I think you could also say like, what I've heard Vietnamese people say is like Tết Trung Thu, which is like the Mid-Autumn Festival. And then the second part here, this phrase means the first day of the year. And I guess the Cantonese pronunciation would be something like Yun Dan, Yun Dan. On Wiktionary, I did find the Hoisanese transcription here, Hoisanese pronunciation. I don't know much Hoisanese, but if you speak Hoisanese, please try to correct me as something like Gun An. And then for Taiwanese, something like Guan Dan or Hokkien speakers. And in the Mandarin language, aka Guori or Pudonghua, aka Mandarin Chinese, it's going to be Yuan Dan. Something I find interesting here is that this first character is a lot of meanings. In this case, the meaning is something like the first, so it's like the first day, right? In Japanese, they took this kanji and applied it on the word moto, which means first. I did find that there is a light novel from 2019 called The Banished Former Hero Lives as He Pleases. And former hero in that, the title of that light novel is translated in Japanese. Well, I mean, the original Japanese is Motoeyu. So for all you anime fans out there, that is one connection that I just learned. I'm starting to learn more about anime through diffusion, if you will. So yeah, another thing you'll notice here is probably the most common phrase for wishing people Happy New Year. Chúc mừng năm mới, which means Happy New Year. That's the Vietnamese way of saying it. One thing I did want to point out here is, just so I could give a shout out to Cambodians, the word for year in Vietnamese, năm, this is one of the words where linguists do think it's related to the word for year in Cambodian, one of the words related between Vietnamese and Cambodian. So in Cambodian is knam, which nam I think is the pronunciation here. I did try to write the script, it's still a work in progress. Chinese will probably go with 新年快乐. That's the Mandarin, aka Putonghua, aka Gori pronunciation. Counter pronunciation would be more like 新年快樂. It just means Happy New Year. Wish you a Happy New Year. I did learn a few Vietnamese specific well wishes for the New Year as well on this page. So if you see right here, Công chúc Tân Xuân, and that is kind of like saying let's celebrate the new spring. It was a spring festival, right? So New Year's happening around the time of spring, and actually if you talk to people from mainland China, they may translate quote unquote Chinese New Year as quote unquote spring festival when they're speaking to English speakers. Here's another one that I found right here, and I think this is also Vietnamese specific. I'm trying to learn this one. An khang thun vượng. So like the first part, it means like to be safe or secure. That one exists in Chinese, different pronunciations. Chinese may actually flip the second character, the second compound here. So instead of saying sheng wang, the terminology would be like wang sheng, and then of course the equivalents in the pronunciations in other Chinese languages. So just wishing someone, you want to be safe and prosperous at the same time in the coming year. Here's an interesting thing. I noticed that right here, 特的, so that means Wednesday. And the Chinese here, 星期三 in Mandarin, has kind of this mismatch in the number. So de is a formal kind of like term meaning four here in Vietnamese. And whether you say sinh ke sam in Cantonese or xin qi san is the third day. So why is it that Vietnamese consider Wednesday the fourth day, the Chinese consider Wednesday the third day? Well, the reason is because Vietnamese is getting this convention from the Portuguese, quarta-feira. So Portuguese decided that Wednesday would be the fourth day and actually displaced the original term miércoles, which if you're a Spanish speaker is related to miércoles, which is the word for this day of the week in Spanish. And then this, of course, comes essentially from this Latin term meaning Mercury's day, the day of Mercury the planet, Mercury the god. The Germanic speakers calqued it as Odin's day, using Odin, which is a Norse god, as an equivalent of Mercury, and that is where we get the English word Wednesday. So that's kind of how all this happens. And there's a lot of good explanations, videos online about how different days of the week are named differently in different languages. So that's interesting. Since this was a Buddhist temple, right, they're going to have kind of like Buddhist references and Buddhist phrases all across this calendar. So did want to take a look at what's written here. So I'm going to try to pronounce this in Vietnamese. Please correct my pronunciation. Lấy Đức Phật Di Lạc Tạng Sanh. So very interesting thing is this is where people have equated, Buddhists have equated the birth date of the Maitreya Buddha with the first day of the Lunar New Year. So the Đức Phật part here means virtuous Buddha, and lei is like, I guess, like a ceremony, right? And then I did also try to look up this part, the Yi Lak, which is the Vietnamese equivalent of the name of Maitreya Buddha. And then the Tang Sen part here means to be born. And just so I can add in a little bit of Korean here, this phrase does exist in Korean as tansing. So I think in Korean, if you say like tansing teda or tanseng하다, it means to, give birth, to be born. So I add in a little bit of Korean here. I practice my Korean. So yeah, today is technically also the birthday of the Maitreya Buddha, as I've learned from this little blurb. Now here we kind of have this proverb. I don't know. I still have to look into where this actually comes from, but then I'll try to read it in Vietnamese. Again, correct my pronunciation, and then hopefully try reading the English in my British English accent, which is also a work in progress. So here we have Nếu cất chân lên, nên nguyện chúng sanh, hỏi biển sanh tử, đủ các pháp lành. When raising the legs, they should wish that all beings leave the sea of birth and death and fulfill all good qualities. So that's very interesting to read and very hopeful. I did learn some verbs here in Vietnamese. So I guess guk, it means to raise or to lift. That's raising your legs. I think there's this kind of pattern here. You raise up, guk lên. So guk chung lên, raise your raise the legs up. And then Nguyen here is to wish. I guess it's kind of literary. It's coming from Chinese. Hoi means to leave, right? So hoi being, to leave the sea. And then du, I guess it means to be enough. I did notice that dai du, it kind of means to be plentiful in Vietnamese, I think is kind of the meaning. That seems to be a pretty common phrase, good phrase to learn. So yeah, those are some of the verbs I've learned from reading this. Then there's also this like Buddhist leanings, Chinese derived vocabulary, Jumsan, all living beings, and its concept of Buddhism. I did try to look into the original phraseology in Sanskrit and Pali. It's like sattva. So sattva kind of is derived from this root in Sanskrit being like truth. In this case, Buddhism kind of adapted to mean like living beings, and then I guess sandu is like birth and death, sensi in Mandarin, right? And then fap is essentially a good word to learn here as well. Fap lan means good qualities. That's the way it's translated here. But then fap in general, it's essentially the Sino-Zenic equivalent of this Buddhist concept of dhamma or dharma, right? And that's a pretty complicated topic. Now, if you don't care about the language stuff, let's do some math instead. So here we have Nam Uk Di. So what does that mean? Well, that is actually one of the years in the Chinese sexagenary cycle. So what is that? Well, it's the ancient Chinese way of keeping track of the years. And this particular year is the Ukdi year, or Yi Si in Mandarin. And that is associated with the wood snake. More of that later. This is the 42nd year in this sexagenary cycle. 42, of course, is the answer to life, universe, and everything in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But what is Yi Si? What is this year and how do we derive it? 乙巳是什么意思? Well, that is what I will explain. So basically, in order to talk about the sexagenary cycle, you have to understand what the heavenly stems and the earthly branches are. In Chinese, this is collectively known as gan zhi, and then the gan is short for tian gan, which is the heavenly stem, and the zhi is short for di zhi, which is the earthly branch. And there are 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches. So how do we use these stems and branches to start numbering years? Well, they're going to start pairing off. So I move to the second one here, right? You take the first heavenly stem, okay, and you pair it with the first earthly branch. First heavenly stem with the first earthly branch for the name of the first year. And then you pair the second heavenly stem with the second earthly branch, and that becomes the name of the second year, and so on and so forth. The key here is that there's a differing number of stems and branches. They're going to start to pair off. So, can we calculate how many different years are in one cycle? Or how many unique names are going to be in one cycle? Well, how do we do that? Well, we take the number of earthly branches, and then we subtract the number of heavenly stems. That will give us the offset, the relative offset of the stems in comparison with the branches. So 12 minus 10 is equal to 2. And then we got to figure out the number of stem cycles, meaning the cycles that the heavenly stems go through before the next match between the first stem and the first branch. Well, that's going to be whatever multiplies 2 to give us 12. And 2x equals 12. We solve for x equal to 6, which means we must go through 6 cycles of the stems until the first heavenly stem pairs with the first earthly branch again. So then, now all we have to do is multiply the number of heavenly stems in a single cycle, which is 10, with 6. And that gives us the total years, a total of 60 years. And that is why this whole process, the name for this is English, is sexagenary, because the sexa root, the prefix S-E-X-A, means 60. So then now let's go back to this year, which is the 42nd year. So if this is a 42nd year, then we should expect that the stem and the branch actually check out based on the pairing off. So there are 10 stems. How do we find out which stem year 42 should be? Well, we just take 42 and find the modulus of 42 with 10. 42 mod 10 is 2, so we should find the second stem, right? So the second stem is this guy. And then for the branch, we do 42 mod 12 because there are 12 branches. That gives us 6. So then in the branches, we have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to get this guy right here. And that is essentially uk di in Vietnamese, yi si in Mandarin. And then the first part here is associated with wood. These are like the 5 elements in Chinese. Second part here is also associated with animal because there are 12 of the branches. Each branch is also associated with one of the zodiac animals, and this is the snake year. So, Chinese sexagenary cycle. Hope you learned something.